Warmly welcome to this event on fossil fuel company strategy in the age of climate emergency, a lunchtime conversation. Whether it's a lunchtime conversation probably depends on which time zone you are currently based on. Finnish lunchtime might have actually happened by now. We usually start already at 11, but anyways, I hope that you get at least some mental nutrition from this discussion today. The organizers of this event are member of the European Parliament, Michael Bloss, Leave It in the Ground initiative, and Hiilivapaa Suomi, which translates as Coal-Free Finland. And the event is made possible by the support of the International Alumni Center of the Bosch Alumni Network. My name is Oras Tynkkynen, and I will be your moderator today. Perhaps just to start with a couple of quite practical housekeeping rules. First of all, this event is recorded so that people can come back to it and watch it again if they so want, or they can share it with their friends and colleagues. We intend to have time for questions and comments towards the end of this event. So please, if and when you have those, to write them down to yourself. You can share them in the chat, and we will try to follow the chat and pick very good questions and comments from there. If you want to tweet or use any other social media platforms, I would suggest that you could use Ilmastokriisi in Finnish, and then Fortum works in any language. So perhaps those could be the hashtags for today. Before we get properly started with the discussion, we would want to know a bit more about you who are joining us today. We are doing that through a Mentimeter poll, and that works by going to menti.com, and there you have to enter the code that you can hopefully see at the top of the screen, that 7-digit number, and then you should be able to enter the country or the area you're joining us from. So please do that. Let me see if it works. So we are getting some countries. So it is menti.com. It should work on smartphones and computers, obviously. I can see that there is someone who very strongly defends the autonomy of the Åland Islands, which kind of is part of Finland, but we respect the autonomy, of course. So that is perfectly okay. Scotland, perhaps the same case. I understand if not everyone wants to identify with the UK at all times, so welcome. Quebec, we seem to have a lot of regional identities represented today. So perhaps not surprisingly, it seems that Finland is quite strongly represented, but we also have people from other parts of the world. All obviously warmly welcome. Those of you who are joining us from really challenging time zones are very much welcome, of course, if you are staying up in the middle of the night to hear this conversation today. Today we will be discussing fossil fuel company strategies in the age of climate emergency, and we will consider in particular the case of Fortum, which is an energy company that is majority owned by the Finnish state. Fortum is very active in many parts of Northern Europe in particular, and Russia as well. And it has been quite a bit in the headlines recently because it acquired a majority stake in Uniper, which is a company that is quite invested in a lot of fossil fuel projects and is still considering to invest in some more. We have a pretty packed agenda today with a list of great speakers, so I don't want to take too much of your time. So I would go straight into it. I would now invite Michael Bloss to share his welcoming words. Michael is, like I said, a member of the European Parliament representing the Greens. Recently, he has been extremely central and active in the discussions in the European Parliament on the European climate law. but also before he has been taking action on the ground, supporting activities like the very famous Ende in Germany. So Micha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Oras, and thanks everyone for joining into this very important call and webinar. How do we get energy companies to be part of the transition away from fossil fuels? I think it's absolutely central that we are creating answers to this question. I think this last week brought us a good step forward with the US elections, and if Joe Biden does what he promises, the Climate Action Tracker says we are in the possibility to keep the 1.5 degree temperature goal. That's really great news. Still, we are in a climate emergency. We see that all around the world. The hurricanes and the wildfires tell stories about it. So we have to be very quick. And in these times, actually, it's an interesting also view from Germany because as you just mentioned, I have been involved also in the fight against the lignite coal and against coal, and Uniper itself just opened a new coal-fired power plant in Germany, Datteln 4. So I guess it's not the time in 2020 to have new investments, a new opening of coal-fired power plants and fossil fuel infrastructure. And the question is really, how do we move away? How do we make also energy companies a part of the solution? I think it's possible. We see that it's not only activists who want us to move away from this, but there is more and more businesses also joining this and this direction, and therefore it is important to see what is possible. And in this regard, we have today a lot of great experts, interesting perspectives on the panel. And I just want to say hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm really looking forward to this call. And now I'm looking forward to enjoy the debate and conversation and presentations from you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Micha, for reminding us about the state of climate emergency and also about the role energy companies can and need to play in the energy transition to zero carbon futures. And thank you also for hosting this event, because without you, we would not be here discussing these important issues. Next up, we are very happy to have Krista Mikkonen, who is the Finnish Environment and Climate Minister. She has been for a very long time involved in green politics in Finland, but more recently, as Finland had the EU presidency, she led the discussions in the EU Council on EU's climate neutrality targets. So she played a very important role there. So we are very happy to welcome Minister Krista Mikkonen. You have the floor.
Thank you, Oras, and dear friends, many greetings from Finland. First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this important event and the opportunity to talk to this occasion. Climate change and nature loss are main challenges of our time. Though at the same time we are in the middle of the public health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19. In the middle of this unexpected situation caused by global pandemic, Finnish government is still strongly committed to our climate neutrality target. In our government program, we set a target to become the world's first carbon neutral welfare state by 2035. That means building our future wealth on circular economy and stopping the biodiversity loss. For Finland, the carbon neutrality means that our long-term energy policy goal is to phase out the use of all fossil fuels and move towards an emission-free energy system. We have already prohibited by law the use of the coal for energy by May 2029. In order to move even faster, we have set an investment aid to promote voluntary phase out of coal by the end of the 2025. The use of fossil oil in heating will be phased out by the start of the 2030s and already by 2034 in properties owned by the central and local governments. This autumn, as a part of our national economic recovery package, we started an investment aid for homes and local government buildings to give up oil heating. This aid has been very popular, and already more than 5,000 households have applied this aid. The energy use of peat will be at least halved by 2030. In my opinion, we have all the possibilities to give up peat even faster. On September, the Finnish government agreed to increase the taxation on peat and other fossil heating fuels, such as coal, natural gas, and fuel oil. In addition, a price floor mechanism will be introduced in peat taxation in 2022, which together with the ETS pricing will ensure that the target of halving the energy use of peat by 2030 will be met. We are also preparing a longer-term energy taxation reform to support climate neutrality goal 2035. In transport sector, we are committed to reduce emissions by half by 2030. It's a real challenge for us, but I'm sure we can do it. At the moment, we are preparing a roadmap for fossil-free transport. The roadmap will be completed by the beginning of the next year. The COVID-19 crisis recovery measures provide a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to accelerate green investments. We must make sure we use public resources wisely, solving at the same time as many crises as we can. Our government saw it essential to make economical recovery to work for, not against, our ambitious environmental targets. In June, we made our first recovery package. In all, it included some 1.5 billion worth of measures this year, which fulfill the criteria of sustainable recovery, such as subsidies for renewable energy, building rail infrastructure, investing in electric vehicle charging stations, sustainable infrastructure projects for municipalities, research and development for circular economy, clean tech, and low carbon innovations. In September, we decided on our budget for the next year. I'm very happy to say that this budget includes several measures to speed up our work to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss. For example, raised funding for biodiversity, new grant for climate-friendly industry and processes, measures to lower greenhouse gases in agriculture, steering and changing industry grants for climate-friendly development, change of transportation grants towards climate-friendly possibilities. Our government also decided on the main outlines of our sustainable growth plan, which is our national plan to use the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF. What was very important is that the government decided that about half of the funding will be dedicated to the green transition objective. Dear friends, we need to do climate policy in all sectors and to involve all stakeholders. That's why our government also wants to foster responsible ownership policy. This is especially important in the face of the health and climate crisis we have today. The government resolution on state ownership policy was updated earlier this year. I'm very happy how this policy stresses climate and environmental responsibility in addition to more traditional principles such as predictability. All state-owned companies must base their operations on corporate social responsibility. Aside from financial consideration, companies must take into account the social, regional, and environmental impacts of their activities. The state expects state-owned companies to lead the way in the transition to a carbon-neutral circular economy, digitalization, and responsibility. This all should be reflected in 3 key areas: goals, strategies, and reporting. In the future, we expect the state-owned companies to analyze the impacts of climate change on their operations and give them due consideration in their strategies. At the same time, companies need to recognize the impacts of their own operations on the climate, environment, and nature, as well as set ambitious goals in this respect. All state-owned companies should take into account the goal of carbon neutral Finland in 2035 and the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. The goals must be achieved by strengthening sustainable competitiveness and in socially responsible way. The state-owned companies are to report on the impacts of climate change on their operations, the climate objectives, and actions taken to the annual general meeting of shareholders. In addition, the companies report on their corporate social responsibility performance and sustainability in their annual reports. When discussing state-owned companies, it's also important to remember that state doesn't play an operative role in the daily functions. And also in many companies, state is just one shareholder among others. This is why strategy work is so important. Dear friends, in the end, I would like to reflect a bit the importance of EU and EU collaboration for our climate and nature targets and to our green recovery. During last years, we have seen the need for the European Union to lead by example in taking determined climate action in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. At the moment, EU is in process to update our 2030 emission reduction target to at least 55% and working towards our long-term target of climate neutrality by 2050. The most important tool to make this happen is European Green Deal program, our roadmap to a sustainable economy. The impact assessment shows that increasing the 2030 climate target is feasible, realistic, and beneficial for the EU and Finland. It will make the EU a forerunner in the global green shift. I very much agree with this view. The technologies we need are mostly there. The businesses are ready. Finnish businesses see ambitious climate policy as a possibility, not a threat. The transition to a climate-neutral economy offers opportunities for the future. Now we just need to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Mikkonen. That was a wealth of issues. I would love to highlight so many of them, but let me just perhaps underline a couple of them. Thank you for pointing out that we need to phase out all fossil fuels and not only coal. And thank you also to Finland for its leadership when it comes to setting a climate neutrality target by 2035 and phasing out coal by 2029. I also think that you made a very important point about the role of green recovery. We need to build back better and not build back the same fossil intensive system that we used to have. And finally, thank you also for providing a segue for today's discussion regarding the role of state-owned enterprises and how they need to lead the transition and also to include considerations like the Paris Agreement into their strategies. I think that painted a perfect backdrop for our discussions today. Before moving on to the next speaker, we have another Mentimeter poll. This time we would want to hear your views on what you think Fortum should be doing with its coal power plants. And it's the same place, menti.com, and it's the same code you can see written up there. That's the number. And I hope, while I do like all these countries, that we can get the new one. This is not what I expected, but I hope it is working as planned. And there you go. At least now I can see the options. What should Fortum do with its coal power plants? And I just also say that it might tell you that you have given a wrong answer. That is not true. We are not really judging your answers. We want to hear different perspectives, but it's just a technical thing. At least I don't know how to resolve in Mentimeter. But here I think we have the results. So what you are saying, at least those who were able to use Mentimeter, you're saying that Fortum should actually keep the coal power plants rather than sell, and then shut them down as quickly as possible. And this is indeed something we will be coming back to today in the following presentations and interventions. Let me now turn to Steve Hertz, who is joining us from Sierra Club. And to those of you who may not know, Sierra Club has been one of the key players when it comes to putting coal power in the US into very rapid and terminal decline. So congratulations on that. I believe that you serve as a senior attorney at Sierra Club. Am I correct?
Yes.
And also I should say that you're joining us very early from your local time zones. So I hope you have at least had your cup of coffee, if not lunch yet at this time. And again, congratulations on the election result, which already was referred to earlier. But Steve, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Horst. And it is early or late, depending on how you look at it. So I was asked to talk a little bit about financial mechanisms that could be used to accelerate the closure of Fortum's coal fleet in a economic and just way. And my remarks are based mainly on research that we conducted with the Rocky Mountain Institute and Carbon Tracker Initiative. And my main message here is that rather than sell its coal plants, Fortum has a real opportunity to use innovative financial mechanisms to retire them early, and generally can do so in a way that saves customers money and frees up resources that can be used to facilitate a just transition for workers and communities that are directly affected by the closure. So if we can get the next slide, please. So the place to start, as the minister mentioned, was the government resolution on state ownership. As she was saying, Fortum's corporate strategy should account for Finland's 2035 carbon neutral goal and for the Paris Agreement goal of limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees rise. And divestment or sale of the coal fleet is not an acceptable alternative to decarbonization. And the reason for that is obvious. Even if you think about carbon neutral Finland not being directly impacted by plants around the region, it's clear that selling the plants does nothing to achieve the Paris objectives. So if you take the Paris objective seriously, it requires giving careful attention to closure. So in the next slide, please. So if you think about what does a global 1.5 degree coal phase out pathway look like, the IAEA constructed one earlier this fall. This one up on the screen now is broken out by technology type. Basically, they have coal use declining by 80% below 2010 levels by 2030, and essentially off the global grids by 2040. Next slide, please. If you look at it regionally, Climate Analytics broke up the same data, looked at it regionally. It implies the OECD, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union all off coal essentially by the end of the decade or 2031. Now, phase out on this timescale obviously won't be easy, but the point that I really want to emphasize here is that it's actually an enormous economic opportunity. So if we can go to the next slide. In the European Union, it turns out that 80% of the current coal fleet is actually uncompetitive right now. And that will rise to 100% in 2025. And when I say it's uncompetitive, what I mean is a plant would be considered uncompetitive when it's cheaper to build new renewable capacity and backup battery storage than it is to continue to operate. So if you look at the existing fleet, if you were to immediately replace the uncompetitive coal plants in the EU with renewable plus storage, it would generate $10 billion in annual net savings. If you did it in 2025, it would generate $21 billion. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this does not even account for the externalized environmental and health costs. So it doesn't consider the costs of sickness, premature death, lost worker productivity due to air pollution and other environmental impacts. So let's go to the next slide. If you look at it geographically, it's now cheaper to replace coal plants with renewable energy everywhere Fortum Uniper is operating plants, with the exception of Russia. In Russia, it will be cheaper next year in 2021. So let's go to the next slide. If you look at this and how this plays out across the portfolio, I direct your attention to the last two columns. So the last column looks at the year in which coal plants are uneconomic in the countries of operation. And like I said, it's basically everywhere today except Russia, but 2021. And then the second to last column shows that a lot of the plants in the portfolio are actually unprofitable now. They're actually losing money as they operate. So a number of these plants are both unprofitable and uneconomic. In other words, ripe for closure. So if we go to the next slide, what this implies is that closing coal plants is really an economic opportunity. The problem, or one of the problems, is that customers are stuck paying for expensive and dirty coal for potentially years into the future with little opportunity to change their electricity source. And so the question that this poses is, how do you unlock the opportunity in a way that will actually benefit customers, but also benefit other stakeholders, owners, workers, communities, and the overall public? And the answer that we came up with in our reports is through innovative financing. So if you can go to the next slide, there are a number of innovative tools that can be used to do this, but we think they should have three components. The first is to refinance or buy out existing coal plants and close them. The second is to reinvest in replacement renewables and enable utilities to use the proceeds from the refinancing or the buyout to pay for the replacement renewables and thereby earn money on returns from clean energy rather than clean returns from dirty energy. And the final step is to set aside money for a just transition. So let me just run through some quick examples of how this could work. I have three. So we'll go to the next slide. The first is ratepayer-backed securitization, which is a fancy term for a kind of refinancing. So basically, where plants have outstanding debt, you can raise low-cost debt by customers and allow that to pay off the existing debt and reinvest in replacement renewables. And the way that's done is by raising debt and having a line item charge on customers' bills that can be securitized and used to pay off the debt. So through that mechanism, customers can save money because refinancing plants with low-cost debt and replacing it with cheaper renewables is actually cheaper in many instances than continuing to run expensive plants. This is a tool that actually has a long pedigree. It was used in the 1980s in the United States to close uneconomic nuclear plants, and it's now being used in states like New Mexico to close uneconomic coal plants. So if we can go to the next slide, the second mechanism is a carbon bonus. Carbon bonus is more like a straightforward payment for closure. It's more appropriate where plants are remain competitive and profitable since it uses some concessional public money. In these schemes, a plant owner would receive a payment based on the avoided emissions through early retirement and a just transition. And so payment can be in a lot of different forms. It could be in the form of a direct payment. It could be in the form of debt forgiveness, or as the Inter-American Development Bank is piloting in Chile, it can be through an interest rate concession on loans to finance the replacement renewable energy costs. The key thing here is the concessional funds need to be allocated competitively, such as through a reverse auction, to ensure that you're not over subsidizing the closure. And we think if you look at the economics of Fortum's portfolio, that because so many of the plants are uncompetitive and or unprofitable, it's likely that you'd find through a competitive process that very little concessionality is actually needed to accelerate the closures. The last mechanism I wanted to touch on the next slide is equity-based approaches. So there are models for doing this based on bad bank models that have been used to clear up bad assets off troubled banks. And basically in this scenario, the government puts in money into a fund and draws in, and it can be government funds, it could be multilateral development bank, climate funds, buys up coal plants and commits to retiring them. And the existing owners make a commitment to use the proceeds to fund replacement renewables. So last slide, please. So conclusion is that early retirement of these plants is not just a climate and environmental opportunity, it's a huge economic opportunity. And a number of mechanisms can be used to retire, replace, and support a just transition. Which mechanisms or combinations of mechanisms are most appropriate in a particular circumstance will depend on a lot of local factors, plant economics, the regulatory environment, et cetera. The key thing is if you ask the question, not whether the plant should be closed, but how they should be closed, then if you apply some thought and creativity to this question, the right mechanisms can certainly be crafted. And given that, a strategy based on selling plants would be both a significant lost opportunity and frankly, a failure of imagination. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for reminding us that actually coal power is not only bad for the climate, it's also uneconomical in an increasing number of cases. And thank you for also sharing some very concrete tools we could use in phasing out coal power. And finally, I think it's very important that you brought the concept of just transition into this discussion. And I know that we will be coming back to that later on as well. Before we move on to the next speaker, we have one final Mentimeter poll. We have been practicing it now a couple of times, so now it should be perfect. So again, it's menti.com and the code is the same. You can see it up there. And this time we would like to hear your views on the role of fossil gas in the future. And I hope it works. Let's see what happens. Yes, indeed, now we have the options. And you click one, you probably get the wrong answer again. Never mind that, we appreciate all answers. Yeah. So let's see. There is quite a bit of support for the option, it's the worst thing that can happen to the climate. A bit of other and a bit of bridge fuel. So it's good that we get some diversity here as well, because this leads really nicely to our next speaker, who is Frida Kinininger from Food and Water Action Europe. Frida is a Brussels-based campaigner working to ban fracking in Europe. And she will be talking about fossil gas and its role, if any, in the future. So Frida, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. I hope everybody can see my presentation. Great. Okay, so we heard a lot about coal, and today I would just like to talk about the notion of gas as a bridge fuel, as a transition fuel, and some of you indeed have answered that it could be having a role, and I would like to set out some arguments on why this is actually quite a dangerous assumption for our climate. So if you look at the climate impact of gas, it is clear that the EU member states cannot reach the climate neutrality targets, including fossil gas. Gas is already now responsible for 22% of the EU's energy-related CO2 emissions. And I want to really make a highlight on CO2 emissions, because a big additional problems concerning gas is that it doesn't only emit CO2, but also methane. So in the 25% of emissions, that is not even included. More about that later. We already see that there is a huge oversized gas infrastructure grid in Europe, and there are plans to invest even more in this. There are plans to invest over 100 billion worth gas infrastructure projects in the future. Nevertheless, all across Europe, public opposition against fossil gas is rising. I will also show you a bit more about that later. Of course, there are other issues like human rights impacts and geopolitical implications linked to fossil gas, and especially the import of it from countries like Azerbaijan, Russia, Libya, the United States, and so on. Okay, my next slide. This is just to highlight a bit more the issue of methane that is linked to gas. You see here very briefly that the red part of the graph, this is the impact of this is the impact of methane emissions, and it is adding up to the CO2 emissions, which might seem quite nicely. And on the right hand side, you see how big an impact the fact that we have to reduce methane emissions can have on the curve of the climate. On the global warming. There has been a study by the Energy Watch Group made in 2019, and they compare what is happening emission-wise if you switch, for example, from coal for electricity generation to gas and new gas, or if you replace oil in heating with gas. New gas, this is meaning the forms of gas that are imported, for example, via LNG. So they're liquefied and shipped across the ocean and are even emitting every day on sea, or that are being extracted with the brutal extraction method called fracking, for example, in the United States. So of course, I really want to highlight that there is not a race that gas is better or worse than coal. It is just to highlight again that it should not be an either or. It's indeed, as also the minister has said, a phase out of all fossil fuels that is needed. Very briefly on the stranded assets issue concerning infrastructure, and here especially LNG import infrastructure, we just made a little calculation showing how the utilization rate of actual import terminals to import liquefied natural gas, or as we say, liquefied fossil gas are, and almost throughout the last years, on average, none of the, so all the import plants have been used at less than 25%. I added here as well a study, a hint to a study from Artelis, which has been looking at gas infrastructure plans worth 29 billion that are considered top EU priority and are on the so-called PCI list. And this study found that none of those infrastructure projects is needed for security of supply of the European Union. And then very briefly, and maybe also this is linked to the fact that there is only a low capacity of the already existing infrastructure, LNG import plants used. There has been the news that Uniper has issues with finding interest in actually the LNG import terminal that is planning in Wilhelmshaven, and is planning to change the plans concerning that. Concerning public opposition that I mentioned in my first slide, here are just a few impressions, and there actually have been LNG import terminals cancelled in Sweden. There has been a big civil disobedience movement against coal that has been this year first time also looking at fossil gas infrastructure, which is just showing that really the public attention is also shifting to the gas as a big problem. Gas is indeed a big problem, even if it might be covered behind so-called solutions. We see also Uniper has an interest in hydrogen and is involved in hydrogen projects. But we have the issue that it might be becoming a hidden solution to avoid stranded fossil fuel assets and to use hydrogen as a new gas, which is apparently not having emissions, to still keep alive infrastructure or import infrastructure of fossil gas in Europe and beyond. And for this end, hydrogen is hyped for to be used in all sectors and to be used at a huge scale, which will indeed keep our dependency on import countries and even create huge projects to produce hydrogen, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to import that hydrogen to Europe. There are plans, for example, in Germany to do that. And when we look at today, how much of the hydrogen is actually produced with renewable energy, I made a red circle here. It's 0.1% that is green hydrogen that is based on renewable energy. The rest of that is based on fossil fuels or nuclear energy. So we have to consider that if we are believing the hydrogen hype, that it could be a solution for the climate crisis. There are also attempts from the fossil gas lobby to make hydrogen seem greener and cleaner as it actually is. This is just to illustrate a bit how huge the amount of projected volumes of hydrogen in Europe are being. At the left-hand side, you still see that there is green hydrogen, which is based on renewables and created with renewable energy. And the blue part is hydrogen that is created with fossil fuels. And we, as I said, have almost only fossil fuel-based hydrogen today. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there is the lines between those two hydrogens are being blurred so that the people are led to believe that all hydrogen is clean, even though it's based on fossil fuels. And here is just a tiny overview about the issues linked to fossil-based hydrogen, that it is dependent on capturing and storing CO2, which is an unproven technology, which is linked to a lot of risks and also is not as efficient and leaks as it is being told. And there have been issues with this technology being picked up. And I know since the time is very short, just to touch very, very briefly upon the issue of the fossil gas and the fossil fuel lobby in this, we see that especially here on EU level, where I'm working on, we have the issue that the fossil gas industry is basically invited on the negotiation table to discuss energy and climate law with decision makers on EU level. There are several examples for that on the gas and on the hydrogen side, and that therefore we need to definitely make sure that we are building a firewall between decision makers and the fossil gas lobby, so that the climate laws are definitely leading into the direction that they are supposed to do. And as a tiny illustration, you see the woman with all the Shell logos. Shell is the biggest big oil and gas polluter. This is the energy commissioner of the European Union, posing happily in these kind of logos. So we, as the Fossil Free Politics Coalition, and I posted also here the screenshots of our website, have a few demands on how to block the fossil fuel industry of interfering with crucial laws we need for our future. Yes, but I think I will leave it at that, and happy to take further questions later.
Thank you very much, Frida. And thank you for reminding us that actually fossil gas is responsible for a very large chunk of our emissions already today, which sometimes gets forgotten, and especially if you factor in the methane emissions leaking from the system. And thank you also for bringing in two hot topics to the discussion. One is hydrogen, which is very much hyped right now in the European Union. And secondly, lobbying, which I think we will come back to later in the discussion. Clara reminded also about the possibility to ask questions using the Q&A function here in Zoom. And I've noticed that some of you have already used that. Please continue doing so. So when you get questions, do share them in the Q&A function so that we can then have a look at them and try to take as many questions as possible from the floor. Now, let me turn to Chiara Arena and Lena Tille, who will be representing voices from the ground, activists fighting some of these fossil projects. And Frida already mentioned the Wilhelmshaven LNG terminal. She kind of laid the groundwork for this topic, but we would now like to hear you talk a bit about the very concrete action on the ground against fossil gas. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. We're here because we live where Uniper planned until last week to build an import terminal for LNG, liquefied natural gas. And yeah, basically want to say why we think it's a bad idea and what has been going on the ground against this terminal. And just a little recap of what Frida already said, going through 3 main points of LNG. Basically saying that the methane emissions and the CO2 emissions of LNG have been consistently underestimated, not taking into account leakages and the whole life cycle. Secondly, LNG is really not an efficient energy resource in the sense that 25% of energy are lost in production and transport of LNG. And thirdly, only 25% of terminals in Europe, LNG terminals, are currently used, like 25% of the potential is being used. So there's no need to get new terminals while the old ones are not being used. So all of this leads us to say that LNG stands and falls with political support. So if we now look into the situation of politics, basically, there's different pictures that emerge. So overall, we can definitely say that there's still some support on the European and also German level for LNG. But recent and really significant developments have actually shown that this is going into a different direction. So a big one was recently the French energy company Engie stopping its trade deal negotiations with an US LNG provider because the French government is concerned about environmental and climate impacts. Then we have, of course, Uniper announcing last week that they're reviewing their decision for the import terminal in Wilhelmshaven because there's just not enough market interest. And then thirdly, also from the local context, we have seen the effect of bottom-up pressure on the Greens, also on political parties, because the bottom-up pressure has led to a review of the position of the state-level Greens on LNG. And I think this is a really important point to highlight when we look at the upcoming elections in Germany, and that there's quite a significant potential for the Greens to become a big party or biggest party, who knows, and what that means for LNG. So yeah, I'm just going into asking the question, what has led to this political shift now? Lennart, we cannot hear you, you're muted.
Okay, now it should work. I'm sorry. So of course, it would be simplified to say that all the liquefied natural gas projects, so LNG, but also other gas projects, are just being reconsidered because of activism. There are multiple factors. The pandemic surely plays into this with demand destruction, new scientific insights that are really relevant on methane leakages and life cycle emissions are relevant. But I just want to talk about the mobilizations that are going on, of course, since last year that everyone knows about, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, but especially also now looking at the German grassroots context, the history of environmental movement here. Like we have a long history, I would say, on anti-nuclear protests that have shown a lot of effects. Many people know about the Energiewende. But also the 5 to 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years, the ever larger mobilizations of Ende Gelände in the coal mines of Western Germany and also Eastern Germany. Let me just show you a video, and probably you won't hear the music, so I will just try to comment on the side. So these are pictures from the protest in Western Germany. And these are the pictures of the Ende Gelände mobilizations. Maybe you saw it in the beginning. in this specific action, there were over 6,000 people. Also this year, in the Corona conditions, where really you could see a lot of plummeting activists in the beginning, activist numbers, they managed to mobilize again 3,000 people. What is really interesting about Ende Gelände, I think, is their choice really for direct action targeting companies, in this case, RWE. So it's really a different type of activism, still adding to the huge mobilizations, also Fridays for Future. Again, this year, Fridays for Future in September also mobilized over 200,000 people on the streets. I will just let this remaining video run. Okay, so just a couple of words on that. First, the type of activism that Ende Gelände is employing, and also Extinction Rebellion, so peaceful civil disobedience, is increasingly also supported by courts acquitting activists of the charges, because the courts themselves, for example, in Switzerland, acknowledge that it's a necessity to prevent climate breakdown, and increasing numbers of people are waking up to this and are choosing to take these kinds of actions. What we can now see, especially since this year and recently in September, that Ende Gelände is also targeting gas, understanding that a phase out of coal means in many places a phase into gas. But they understand, as we heard earlier from Frida, that gas is a part of the problem and not part of the solution. And what we can see increasingly, movements understanding that empty targets from governments mean very little if the companies that are in these countries, private or public ones, if they are engaged in abroad in actions of expansion, for example, in the gas sector, that this is a huge problem, and they are keeping an eye on these companies. Lastly, I just want to show a recent campaign that we started against gas that is international in nature and will start on the 11th of December. And you will find more information on this website. Thank you.
Let's try again. Thank you very much. And thank you for being able to pack so much important points into a very short presentation, especially when delivered in a duet. So that's very impressive. I would just like to highlight, first of all, really reiterating the point that actual life cycle emissions from LNG are much higher than the figures that are commonly quoted in the discussion if you take into account all the emissions. And then the role of the civil society and people's movements in changing the debate and changing how attractive many of these investments are. I think that's another topic we might want to come back in a moment. We are already getting some very good questions, so please keep them coming. We will make sure to have space for those towards the end of this event. I would now like to invite our panelists to join the discussion. You can do so by first opening your cams so that we can all see you. We have a really great list of speakers in the panel. We have, first of all, Jan-Erik Saugestad, the Executive Vice President from Storebrand Asset Management. Thank you for joining us. We have Kaarina Kolle, who is, I believe, the Finance and Utility Coordinator for European Coal Campaign, as well as representing the WWF European Policy Office. We have Jan Bondaruk, Deputy Director for Environmental Engineering, joining us from the Central Mining Institute in Poland. And we have a very familiar face, that is MEP Michael Bloss, also with us. I should at this point also mention that the organizers of this event worked quite hard to try to get the Fortum representative to join the panel. Unfortunately, the company declined, so we will not be hearing from them directly. Happily, I also do know that many of you are quite familiar with the debate and know the arguments Fortum would perhaps share with us in this type of a setting if they indeed had joined us. So perhaps you can project some of those messages and arguments so that we can also understand better their point of view in this discussion. Let me now start with you, Jan-Erik. You represent a very important asset manager that has taken a really good hard look at the climate risks of your portfolio. Can you talk a bit about your policies when it comes to fossil fuels, and probably to unpack the difference between coal and gas? And I couldn't resist when I saw in the video, we just saw a message basically saying that we need to smash capitalism. I wonder if you can react to that and share your perspectives on, do we really need to smash capitalism, or are there ways to kind of use capitalism to speed up the energy transition?
Well, thank you, and let me just start by saying Storebrand is a life and pension company in Norway and Sweden, and the asset management part of the business is basically investing the pension capital and other institutional capital. So also on behalf of Finnish clients. So we're very happy that our sustainable solutions are now gaining more attention. I don't think we need to smash capitalism. I think it's about getting capital working in a smarter way. And of course, there are many ways of doing that. I think some of them were illustrated by the different models for phasing out coal by Steve earlier in this session. But one key element is, of course, that we're able to price in externalities. So the actual cost of doing business in the wrong way. And for that matter, also rules and regulations that can level the playing field. So companies that want to run business in a more sustainable way are competitive. And here, clearly, there is an important role for the government to play. I would also say that the government have another role, of course, because in many cases they are a major shareholder. And it's only when the investors, companies, and governments work together we can really create change. So that was more on the capitalism. I could probably go on for a while, but let me just be very brief and say we've been working on sustainable investment for 25 years. Clearly, we started off with avoiding the negative impact. So all our capital is adhering to a climate policy and a policy of sustainable investments. We have about 1/3 of our assets currently totally fossil free. We have invested about 8% into what we would say is particularly sustainable solutions. It's about twice the level of capital that we have invested in the fossil heavy part of the value chain. But most of the capital, after all, is invested in the companies in the middle, and that's why this transition is so important, because selling out is clearly and leaving assets for less responsible owners is not the ideal solution, and I think that poll earlier today showed that very clearly. And in doing so, we have to work together. We are working together with other investors in alliances like Climate Action 100+. It's about 450 institutional investors representing about $40 trillion. And we engaged, or the alliance engaged with, for that matter, Fortum, raising concerns about the Uniper acquisitions and challenging them to clarify their phase-out plan. We are working together with governments. We This year, this summer, addressed the Brazilian government over deforestation, led an alliance of 30 other investors in that work. And just the other day, I had another meeting with the central bank in Brazil, raising our concerns about our investments there. We also addressed lobbying. I think lobbying is very counterproductive when investors, companies, and governments are working together. And we actually, in our new climate strategy, decided to challenge many of the oil and gas companies with respect to lobbying. And as a consequence of their response, some of these companies were removed from our investment universe, like Exxon. Chevron, on the other hand, was also removed, but they are now in the process of reviewing their policies and what memberships they have in different organizations as a consequence. So I think change is possible, I always tend to say, but we have to work together.
Thank you very much for the leadership you have shown, and also those concrete examples of changes you can make in the financial markets. We heard earlier from the activists, and I'm paraphrasing here, that basically what has happened to coal is likely to happen to fossil gas next. Do you see that happening in the financial markets, and what is Storebrand's position on that?
Well, if we start with the externalities, I think you see the price of carbon or carbon emissions going up. When I was at the One Planet Summit back in Paris in 2017, I think, the carbon price was at about €7 a ton, and it clearly is on the rise. Probably needs to get to about closer to €80 a ton to really have a detrimental impact on the fossil value chain. But I think we're on that path. As you said, our focus initially was on coal. We started working on coal and challenging also energy production on coal and new investments in coal. We had a huge debacle with RWE in Germany, as probably some of you have seen in the Wall Street Journals or elsewhere. So our priority has really been phase out of coal. Clearly, as we move forward, we are also challenging other fossil fuels. But coal has been the key priority so far, it's fair to say.
Thank you. And we will come back to these topics a bit later on. Let me now move to Kaarina, who I believe is joining us from my other hometown of Brussels, or somewhere where there are much more flamingos than either in Finland or Brussels. You are working very hard to phase out coal power. Can you talk about your perspective on what a company like Fortum should be doing to make that happen in Europe? What would be your wish list for Fortum?
Well, if you only narrow it down to coal in this case, I mean, obviously you have to look at all the fossil fuels. So we do know that Fortum and Uniper will both have quite a lot of capex going into fossil gas. Whereas most of the other sort of front-runner utilities in Europe are actually putting most of capex into renewables. But let's start with the easiest one, because we do know that coal is not very profitable and will not be in the second market where there's quite a lot of coal for Fortum, which is Russia. So what we would need to see is that Fortum wouldn't be selling the assets to the private equity companies that operate in Europe. So we know now that the remaining fleet Fortum has on coal, most of it will go to the reverse auctions, but those plants have been running, quite low hours anyway. So what remains is basically Datteln, as well as the Russian quite polluting coal assets. So what should happen there is that the coal phase-out deadline should be brought forward in Germany, at least for Datteln, as well as then to close the Russian plants as soon as possible. And when the conversions do take place, as they have already, for instance, for Staudinger in Germany, they wouldn't be going into gas. And unfortunately, that very much is the case. So we are kind of going from the frying pan into the fire in regards to that.
Thank you, Kaarina. Both you and some of the previous speakers have been making the point that companies like Fortum should not be selling their coal assets, but should keep them and close them down. I hope I get the argument, but just in case there are people who have not been following this discussion so closely, can you elaborate why that is the case? Why wouldn't it be just good enough for Fortum to sell the assets?
Well, maybe I can start, and if Steve wants to jump in, since we are quite passionate about this particular topic. So maybe if we actually go back to historic examples, so the main sort of sales case that happened in Europe was that of Vattenfall. And Vattenfall is an interesting one anyway, because it's a very much a mirror case to Fortum. Both are state-owned companies, both come from countries that have, at least on the governmental policy level, quite robust sort of climate carbon neutrality targets. However, that doesn't really seem to be translating in the business plans of the state-owned companies. So there is a clear mismatch there, despite the new ownership steering guidelines that came from the Finnish government. So in 2016, Vattenfall basically divested from the majority of their coal assets and sold them to a Czech billionaire, Daniel Kretinsky, who is the CEO of EPH. And again, as a private equity company, once it lands in the hands of a company that doesn't really have shareholders, it means that it's a lot harder to intervene how the assets are being managed. So fast forward to today, those coal plants are still very much in operation. And if Vattenfall had kept them, they would still be the third largest coal emitter in Europe. So basically, that's a hot potato that gets circled around. And that kind of shows that how the emissions don't go away. And we've raised this with Fortum a few times already. So I attended the AGM of 2018, which was immediately after the the prospective M&A with Uniper was announced, and asked a question about this particular topic. Would the assets be sold? Because there was already the example from Sweden, and we assumed that Fortum might be following the same lead. And the answer that we received from Fortum was that it doesn't really matter, because all the assets are within EU ETS anyway. So even if they change the owner, it's just it's going to be the same thing. Going back to Vattenfall, all those coal assets, including Boxberg, Schwarze Pumpe, they are amongst the most polluting coal plants in Europe, all lignite. They will be going offline around at the end of the decade, some of them 35 or 38 in Germany. So basically what Vattenfall did is they baked in decades of additional emissions because they didn't go down the closure pathway. So we fear this will be happening with Fortum again, given that they've been quite clear that because it's under EU ETS, it doesn't matter, despite the MSR, despite the reforms at the EU ETS level, and despite the fact that the German government has indicated that the emission allowances would in fact be cancelled. So in that sense, the cap and the maximum cap argument doesn't really apply. And anyway, most of the assets are in Russia, which is not under EU ETS. And there we hear from Fortum is that it's impossible to decommission in Russia for reasons that have not been clarified. So what we feel is that it doesn't really fit Fortum's strategy or the direction they want to go forward with. So it's easier to divest. But it has more to do on the portfolio level divestment rather than actually getting rid of emissions in the EU.
Thank you, Kaarina. Kaarina helped my job as a moderator by already inviting Steve. I wonder, Steve, if you wanted to come in and react to the same question about keeping versus selling.
No, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think Kaarina gave an excellent answer. I'll just leave it there and let others know.
And we can also
I
come
can
back
add
to
one
this.
more thing because
Sure,
I forgot despite the long monologue. So what we hear from Fortum as well, if you do look at the company pressers and all the statements are coming out, there will be changes in the Russian portfolio soon. And Fortum has been indicating, it's not official yet, but we can speculate that the Russian assets will be going on sale, because Fortum does keep on referring to pruning of the portfolio, rotating the assets. So what probably will happen is they will be sold, and then the revenues or the released capital that comes from it will be reinvested to renewables. But unfortunately, it doesn't really solve the coal problem. So these things don't go one-to-one.
Thank you, Kaarina. Let me now turn to Jan. Fortum has also been active in Poland, and we all know that Poland is still quite dependent on coal, both in terms of energy and also in terms of jobs and economic value. But we also keep hearing that Poland is considering transitioning away from coal and diversifying its energy mix. How do you see the role of companies like Fortum in a country like Poland? What do you think companies like Fortum could do to help the energy transition taking place in Poland?
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to present maybe more intermediate point of view, because as you have mentioned, Poland is a little bit different. Silesia is a region where my institute and me personally are operating, and Fortum has also their own heat and power assets. I mean Zabrze and Częstochowa and some others in Bytom-Miechowice. And yeah, that's right. We are starting our phase out plan, and it will be a long run in the Polish reality. It is agreed between unions and government that the whole process will be finished around 2049, when the last coal mine extraction facility will be closed. And Fortum is, frankly speaking, is maybe it sounds strange, but it's a kind of leader according to transition in our region, because they finished 2 years ago a big investment in Zabrze, where the coal-fired plant is fed by coal and RDF altogether. And this is also a part of our expertise that we are servicing for Fortum to keep the certain quality of emissions and to keep the whole process as it was planned. Moreover, we are expecting that Fortum and many other companies, which are, because it may be good to know that Silesia is our share in general production of energy in whole Poland is 20%, and we also have the biggest coal mine company, PGG, and there are many other companies, and all of those environment, I would say, and ecosystem of those companies are involved in the transition process. This year, we have also agreed our regional strategy, where the transition is a certain part of the whole process. And we definitely expect that Fortum and others will do both. One, keep our energy resilience at the one side, and also give us some good examples and also investments to bring our economy and diversify our economy into less carbon intensive development. That's why we are looking at Fortum not as a company that we are going to fight with, rather as a partner, and that will be very good. And as far as I know, Fortum is involved in many processes in our region, and also our national strategy also sees assets of Fortum as a part of our heat and energy system. What is also good to mention that Fortum also has a heat network grid, which is very important because, as you know, low emission brings to Poland the very negative aspects of health and the bad quality of air, which is also very huge social and economical problem for our regions. So maybe just briefly how it looks like and why Fortum is for us perceived as a reasonable partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I especially wish that Fortum representatives were present here hearing how you see that they can be an important partner and can also lead the way in the transition. Let me also ask something related to the concept of just transition, because I do know that it has been very important for the Polish government. I remember at the UN climate conference in Katowice, they put a lot of effort into just transition. And of course, it's important for all the workers that are today dependent on the coal industry. How do you see the role and importance of just transition for countries like Poland?
Yeah, maybe I haven't mentioned that in our strategy, just transition is a main driver of changes and diversity of our regional and national economy. That's true that during COP24 there was a lot of discussion, and the statement, the final statement elaborated during the COP24 was very strongly connected to the situation of Poland and Polish sector and Polish miners and all socioeconomic related industries and other economic sectors which are linked to the, as we call it, value chain of all interesting parties. And therefore, just transition is not only a strategy. This is a huge transition of our regional and national strategy. We see that it will be a lot of efforts to make it fair and just as it is mentioned. No one should be left behind, but we see even today, because meanwhile we have our regional consultation with our regions, NUTS 3. This is the level that we conducting this discussion, that the expectations are very high. And this is not only a problem of amount of money, because I am always pointing out that this is not a main problem, but everybody would like to change something, and we are trying to avoid a situation to disperse this money. That's why, coming back to Fortum, we would like to locate these investments and these activities in a point that will have the best results with the reasonable amount of money. That's why coming back, more partnerships, more collaboration is needed.
Thank you very much. Micha, you already had a short moment to share your views in the beginning, but I would like to come back to you now. Obviously, you're free to comment on anything you have heard, if there's something in particular you would want to highlight, but perhaps just to touch on the issue of lobbying, because that was raised earlier. I know that has been discussed in the European Parliament. Do you see that as important? Do you think the EU institutions should address better fossil fuel industry lobbying? And do you think that is actually politically realistic and feasible in the coming years?
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of interesting points that have been made and a lot of interesting debates we can have from there. But yeah, just maybe addressing your question first. I have signed this no fossil fuel pledge that was mentioned by Frida. And I think it's important. It's really interesting to see actually that that lobbying can really have this negative effects. We saw that in the hydrogen strategy, where in the first place the studies used for calculating the infrastructure were all based on studies from the fossil industry, and that clearly like went into a really different part. Like, I think we can have the debate about hydrogen infrastructure, but it basically said there has to be a lot of new investments, and it was very pro fossil gas industries, and this would if we would not have spotted it and said, look, this is maybe not balanced, would have also created in a wrong strategy that does not rely on independent scientific research. So we see there is problems, even though I would say, comparing the European level, for instance, to the German level, in Europe we have better lobbying, prevention laws, or let's say we like transparency laws. That is the importance, the transparency. And of course it could be, and it should be improved. And we see, for instance, in the tobacco industry that it was like a good victory, and it improved policy decision making to keep the tobacco industry away from making the laws to govern the tobacco industry. Similar things could be also implemented in the fossil industry. On the other things, I thought it was really interesting to hear about how Russia, also in Russia, coal will become not cost effective anymore. And I was wondering, well, with the carbon border adjustment that the European Union is planning, that would also mean energy imported from outside of the EU with a high carbon footprint possibly would have to be part of this carbon border adjustment, and would then also not be cost effective anymore. I was wondering if this is inside of the calculations that Uniper itself is doing. Unfortunately, I cannot ask them. And I think it's really important to point out also the important roles that a company like Uniper can play also in the just transition. I mean, if the business model is not anymore fossils, but it is renewable energy, or it's energy efficiency, there is a lot of, I mean, potential and a lot of job creation in, and I guess Jan Bondaruk can tell us more about like the energy efficiency, the isolation of houses, renewable energies. Also in Poland, there is great potential in this, and that's beneficial for everyone. No? That's for Fortune, for the local economy, for the small, medium-sized enterprises, for the Polish economy as a whole. So that could be interesting to see where's the opportunities going into a different direction here.
Thank you, Micha. I would very much encourage all of our panelists and our previous speakers to react to what you have heard and share your perspectives. But before we do that, I know that Terhi Lehtonen, who is the State Secretary to the Finnish Minister Krista Mikkonen we heard earlier, she has been listening to our discussion, and she already posed some questions earlier. I wonder, Terhi, if you would like to take the floor and share those questions so that everyone can hear them.
Thank you, Oras. Do you hear and see me, perhaps?
We both see and hear you perfectly.
Very good. And now, of course, I can't see my own notes or questions anymore. So let me try to remind myself of the questions. But I wanted to, and Steve already actually kindly replied on the chat. But I was just wondering, because it's very pertinent and striking what he was showing, that these are uncompetitive and uneconomical assets, and it just beats me. How come they're still running? I mean, maybe if Steve can still come back and just explain to dummies like me that how is it possible that these assets are still being used, and then I was wondering also that whether he sees that the ETS price increases. We have the minister was earlier saying that the EU is increasing climate targets, and it's the Finnish government view that a majority of that increase in ambition should come from the ETS, and we think that should have some solid implications for the carbon price, and whether that would actually do the trick without needing to devise some or use public funds for the coal phase out. And I also wanted to ask about hydrogen, if somebody in the panel wanted to come back on the role of green hydrogen for decarbonizing industry and transport. And we've heard and I fully recognize that the hydrogen that is currently used is for majority is fossil hydrogen, but do you see as well that there is a role for green hydrogen, and how do you see that in the infrastructure? And if you allow me, Oras, I will still throw my third question. I wanted to ask Jan and Jan Erik regarding financial markets, and I found it very interesting that the Polish largest energy company, PGI, if I remember right, has said that they will need to split their coal assets from the company in order to secure funding for future projects. And wouldn't you think that this is kind of a little bit what Steve was talking about, the bad bank, that if this is already the reality, that capitalism might have its faults, but at least some of it is working already, if it means that companies that have coal assets do not get funding for their projects. Thank you, Oras.
Thank you, Terhi. A set of great questions, I guess. Can you, Steve, go first?
Sure, yeah. So on the question of whether the ETS could take care of this, or and why would we use public money? So I probably should have been a little clearer up front. Like, there's plenty of regulatory approaches that you could use to accelerate the retirement of coal plants. The proposals I was walking through are more voluntary approaches that sort of assume the existing regulatory environment, but I totally agree. There's no reason. I mean, this is obviously a core government function, and the requirement should be strengthened, right? Like that's pretty obvious. So I was sort of assuming the absence of stronger regulations. The second question of why do these coal plants continue to operate when they're not profitable or not competitive? So one of the really interesting things that we found is that you would think that if they're competing directly with renewables, they'd be pretty quickly driven off the grid. But what we found looking at the global coal fleet is something like 93% of coal plants don't actually compete directly against renewables. They're shielded in some way. Either they're in they're regulated monopolies in non-competitive environments, or they have long-term contracts, power purchase agreements, and the like. So they're not actually operating in purely competitive markets.
Thank you, Steve. And if I may just add, there are also very often quite considerable political economy factors playing into this. And I don't remember, was it Ohio or Oregon, one of these states in the US, where there was quite a debacle about actually corruption and bribes, making sure that they could keep the coal power plants running.
Yep, that was Ohio.
Ohio. Then hydrogen, I wonder, is that something, Frida, you could perhaps address?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so I think it's a very tricky question, the question of green hydrogen. And in itself, if it would be possible to have fully additional, 100% renewable, and even if it's called renewable, it's we are talking about the EU Renewable Energy Directive, which will be revised. And it seems like there is the danger that even this term might be opened. So if we would really have 100% renewable energy that is additional, so it doesn't take anything away from direct electrification, which should always be the priority if it is feasible, then green hydrogen might be able to play a role in really only those sectors and really only those niches within the sectors where it is no other way to decarbonize. But what we see at the moment is exactly the opposite. It's really a huge hype. It's plans for huge amounts of hydrogen, plans for hundreds of billions of euros put into the EU hydrogen economy, using all kinds of infrastructure that is already there, and putting it into all sectors, like including heating, including personal transport, and so on. So I think there is a lot of caution, because if we want to get it right, if we want to be able to produce sustainable hydrogen, it can only be in very low amounts. And we already see now that we have there have been so many roadblocks in reaching like renewable energy targets. And there, what we're talking about would be huge masses of renewable electricity needed for the amount of hydrogen that is projected. And there we have industry telling us, well, we have another transition. We can use blue hydrogen. We can use hydrogen with carbon capture and storage in the meantime. And it's just like fossil gas, a dead end, because it would need different infrastructure. It would keep dependency on importing fossil gas or other fossil fuels. It would keep the same actors that are profiting from investing in fossil fuels alive. And so what we see here is really trying to fit the concept of green hydrogen within basically business as usual, just exchanging the gas, exchanging fossil gas with hydrogen. And this is not the systemic change that we would need. So there indeed, and with all the pushes from the fossil gas lobby into this topic, there is a lot of caution into this topic, and rather really take it slowly and see what is actually feasible instead of going for the hype, what we see now, and then realizing there are not enough capacities for renewables to do so. And it's unfortunately fossil gas that has to jump in. So this is really an issue that should be avoided.
Thank you. Kaarina, on the same issue.
I actually wanted to discuss green hydrogen potentially as well. And I think from your points, Frida, it would be good to see what actually Fortum says about the topic. And I've checked most of the power utilities in Europe who are moving towards hydrogen, like what are the models there? So we heard two things. What is it's important to see what's the fuel type that's being used and what will be the sector that benefits from hydrogen. So unfortunately with Fortum, they've already indicated that they're quite fine with almost any type of fuel, maybe fossil gas, maybe nuclear, maybe renewable. So they are a bit agnostic about that. And also there has been no specification on the industry type. And if you take as an example RWE, funnily enough, RWE that usually doesn't come across as a positive example, they've said in public that their hydrogen would be exclusively green. And there is a partnership with ThyssenKrupp, which is a steel company, which is actually quite aligned in this particular case with the theory of change that those hard to abate sectors such as steel should be benefiting from green hydrogen first and foremost.
Thank you. Then Terhi had a question to both Jan and Jan-Erik. Jan, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's true that PGE is a Polish energy group and has announced the strategy to shift from the coal assets into more green renewables and coherent and sustainable production of energy. Definitely they promote wind as a source of energy. That's true, and it's one of the example that even big companies now are changing their strategies and are going to follow the regulations. But if you don't mind, I would like to say a word about hydrogen and the approach to hydrogen in Poland. Now it's a huge discussion. Of course, hydrogen is one of the options, but we still insist to keep different colors of hydrogen as a bridge for more sustainable energy production, which is a part of our national strategy. As I have mentioned, low carbon economy is one of the topic, and fair and just transition process and good quality of earth are the pillars of our national strategy. And we are also expecting the strategy for hydrogen production. It should be ready later this year or beginning of the next one, and the new instruments and mechanisms should be in place then. Therefore, for us, hydrogen is one of the options, but we still keep in mind that our road to green energy will be longer than others, because still more than 75% of energy is generated from coal and lignite. And for our regions especially, it's a huge topic, because 78% and deposits of coal, hard coal, is placed in our region. So 80,000 people directly involved in the extraction and production of coal should find new areas of the activity. Therefore, transition in different colors should be implemented and hopefully will be successful. We still call Silesia as a European laboratory because we have all problems in place. Therefore, our institute, Central Mine Institute, is strongly involved in this process.
Thank you, Jan. And then Jan-Erik.
Well, it's an interesting reflection, and I guess investors and creditors working through the capital markets will, one, raise the cost of capital or access to capital. And with the focus on coal in particular, clearly access to capital from institutions is increasingly being limited. And also you see several commercial banks tightening the standards and not granting credits or loans to companies with extensive coal activities. So it is working through that channel. But of course, that then may trigger a sale of the asset to an owner that don't need that access to capital. So, to what extent it's efficient, it's a certain limitation to it. So that's why I think it's important to maintain the argument that you also need, regulations. You need pricing of externalities to actually make this business even more unprofitable, because then it's not only a question about capital, it's just not profitable. But in one sense, you are seeing this taking place in the capital markets. Hence, some of the coal assets are ending up on government hands or even in private hands.
Thank you very much. We have been getting a lot of really good questions. Let me try to squeeze in as many as possible. There have been several questions regarding a project in Canada, a LNG project. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this place, Pieridae. I'm kind of confident that at least one of our great speakers knows this project and can perhaps say something about it, because I definitely don't. So would someone want to react to this particular case and link it to the discussions we have been having? You can also check the more detailed questions in the Q&A box. Any takers? Frida?
Yeah, I can go ahead. And I think there have been a lot of information that are already shared, but basically these are, and maybe Karina, I don't know if you want to add to this, but I think it's just one example that shows how very complex and very risky these plans are getting. It's the plan to import gas from Goulboro LNG terminal, and there is involvement by Uniper into this. And I think in terms of the climate, and I already highlighted this is just showing how there is a push for increasing imports of liquefied natural gas into Europe, and with all that comes with it, with methane emissions, with complex supply routes, with extraction methods that are more than risky, and they're risking the health of the population on where the gas is being extracted. And I think there has been quite a lot of opposition forming against that, and yeah. I think there are materials shared on and how people have been highlighting the issues with this particular supply chain. And this is just one of so many supply chains and so many of the impacts. But it's great that there are people that are organizing around it.
Thank you. Karina, did you want to come in on this topic? And if you do, perhaps can you try to also link it to Fortum's strategies and its role as a state-owned company, and if there is a contradiction between these?
Well, actually, I'm wondering if this particular case may have been blocked because of the Wilhelmshaven LNG terminal not going ahead potentially. So I think some of the activists here might be better placed to comment on that. However, one thing I do want to say is when it comes to gas, especially midstream and downstream, a lot of the financial institutions haven't really picked up on this yet. So this goes back to Jan-Erik on this topic. We get about a new coal policy from European financial institutions every week. and they're getting very granular, very sophisticated. And we are talking about exclusions that go way beyond just project finance, and they are excluding companies, especially those who are expanding fossil fuels in general. But then, so the gas issue doesn't really match the discussions we have on coal yet. So projects like this often fall through the cracks. And also, I think for the Finnish government, this would be a very classic case to kind of step up and look into whether the ban on saying anything that relates to operational matters is actually valid. Because what Krista Mikkonen said earlier is that there are the minority shareholders and we shouldn't be kind of stepping over them, even though the state does own more than 50%. A lot of those remaining financial institutions who are shareholders are actually Finnish pension funds as well. So it comes back to the Finnish people at the end of today. So when the state doesn't really intervene and kind of goes behind the argument that we should not micromanage, well, we have, Stora Brand here who is quite able to do so. So my question is, why is the hesitation there?
That's a good and tough question. Jan-Erik, if you want, you can of course react to that now or later. Lennart, am I interpreting correctly that you would also want to intervene?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it was already mentioned in the chat that, and also what you just said, Karina, that now with the Uniper terminal in Germany being probably dead, like it will be open if Uniper will even still be able to follow up on the 20-year contract. But what is maybe important to keep in mind is that this long-term contract that they have with the producers, or we have in Canada with Pierre, even makes it possible now, especially that there's this plummet in demand for these companies to keep running because they're facing a lot of financial pressure right now. And these long-term contracts really keep up a lot of production and a lot of these activities in the more upstream parts. So there's really a huge responsibility for Uniper, and then in the end also for the Finnish government. Just wanted to bring this in as well.
Thank you. And I could also just inform from the Finnish side that this is not a topic that has been discussed a whole lot in Finnish publicity. So those of you who are very much involved in this particular project and want to get the Finnish state or Fortum to pay attention, then I would perhaps encourage you to try to engage with the Finnish public and the Finnish public discussion on this particular topic. We had a question from Tina regarding Steve's presentation. Closing coal plants is an economic opportunity approach. How do you sell it to Fortum? And then linked to that, does ratepayer-backed securitization exist in Europe? And I think it would perhaps be good to clarify what rate payers and rate-based approaches mean, because that is not necessarily how some of these electricity markets operate in countries like Finland. So what is the linkage there? Perhaps Steve, can you pick that up?
Yeah, so as I said, basically the ratepayer securitization is it's low-cost debt that's paid back through a line item on a customer's bill. That's sort of the simple explanation. I don't know if it exists in Europe. It requires some, in the US, it requires some legislation to implement. You have to sort of authorize the utilities to put it on the bill. And it typically works best in regulated markets. I'm not sure how it would actually be implemented in a fully competitive market. So it depends a lot on the regulatory environment. But again, it's just sort of one approach among many. And the real opportunity there is replacing where there's outstanding debt, and that debt is the obstacle to a plant closure, because the owner has to figure out a way to continue to service the debt, is to find a source of low-cost debt that could replace the higher cost debt. So refinance the plant and use the difference to finance some of the renewable replacement.
Thank you. I think this key question of how do we sell all these options to a company like Fortum really something that perhaps some other speakers would also want to respond. We have been presenting these different options today, but then it is up to Fortum in the end to make the decision. So how would you convince Fortum? How would you argue with them that you really need to go down this road? And I know for sure that Kaarina has been involved in this debate for a long time, but anyone feel free to jump in.
Maybe because we were before discussing the question of smashing capitalism. Well, it's an interesting debate, and we can, I think, talk long about this, long time about this. But the question is really, how do we get systemic change fast? Because the climate crisis is unfortunately not waiting for us to solve this miracle about in which system it works best. I mean, what we do as lawmakers and how we try to convince companies like Fortum is just to change the regulatory environment, and we will do that. I mean, make no mistake, we will have an increase of the EU climate targets from 40% to at least 55%, possibly higher. That's currently in the debate. That means the current price of CO2 certificates in the ETS from 30%, they will go up quite significantly. And so this, I hope, will make the case for a lot of companies to see that there is no business case anymore in firing fossil fuels. So and the other things that we are also seeing is that we have in the current regulatory environment, I mean, this is built for an old world. We have a lot of subsidies still for fossil fuels. And also these subsidies will have to go sooner or later. So that will take away the opportunities. And then I think what we have to do and what we will do is to create an environment where the new world is supported. So we can discuss about supporting, for instance, green hydrogen, but I think what is also important is to support, for instance, quotas for recycled or green steel in different kinds of products like cars also. So what happens in on the European level is this Green Deal, and it's not yet I mean, it's not yet fully clear in which direction it goes, but it's quite clear that that there is a transition happening, and if you're first in this transition, it's better for you than if you are lagging behind. And I guess that's a very clear message that comes from the political side, from the European level. And I hope a lot of companies actually see that and will react to it.
Thank you, Micha. Kaarina.
So just to make one thing clear, Fortum actually is not against, say, tightening of the EU ETS. They want to do it in their kind of own way. So they emphasize things like broadening ETS up to new sectors, such as buildings and transport, neither of which is Fortum's core business, but nevertheless. So I think that's something we cannot blame Fortum on, that they weren't like for the market-based instruments. They are almost at the purest end of the spectrum. So like I said before, quite a lot is brought back to EU ETS, and this is why Fortum actually doesn't have a 2050 net zero target for themselves. They have that for the European level, but not for one that would bind them. But one thing that's important to note is that I think for them, in a way, getting rid of coal is not the issue as long as it doesn't happen cheaply. So this is why most likely the compensation coming from the German government is something they've been fighting for. And the same thing with the lawsuit in the Netherlands, in order to make sure that when they have to close Maasvlakte, that happens against a very hefty sum. So it's more like that type of thing. They would like to squeeze, I think, the remaining value out of the assets, but phasing down coal is actually not the issue. Phasing down gas will be the real issue. And if you look at Fortum's portfolio and the targets they've set, they're extremely behind all the European power players on renewables targets. Take Engie, take Enel, take Iberdrola. They are like in the order of magnitude way further ahead of Fortum. So there, what I would believe is that Fortum doesn't even necessarily try to compete in that category, but rather in the gas segment. And this is where the real fight will happen in the coming years.
Thank you, Kaarina. Jan-Erik, I wonder, did you want to come in? And also there was a question directed directly at you, which is a reference to the CA 100+. Do you see a strategy shift among its members towards divestment away from engagement? I'm guessing lobbying against climate action, as you did with Exxon and Chevron.
Well, I don't think there is a trend towards sort of divestments as opposed to engagement. I think what we are seeing is that the engagement murk is moving in, I would say, the right direction. Now it's more about working together, different institutional investors. It's about measuring what we actually achieve through this engagement, and not only tell people about the number of AGMs and proposals we voted for or against. So I think that is a positive thing, and I do think it's important that we, to the extent possible, stay invested. Of course, there are companies that eventually, through their behavior, just represents a financial risk that lead us to divestments, and that will always be, of course, the threat and a credible threat to a company that a majority of the shareholders will divest. I think that's why also the Brazilian government responded so vigorously to this letter we sent this summer, because they need access to international capital markets. I also wanted to comment on Storebrand. After all, yes, we are the largest asset manager in Norway. We're among the top 5 in the Nordics, but in the end, we're a small shareholder. I sometimes say small and annoying, because even a small shareholder can really shape the agenda, and particularly if we are able to, through networks, inspire and motivate other shareholders to join forces. It is a challenge how a government should exercise their ownership rights, but I think they do need to get more involved, and particularly be more clear in terms of guidance and requirements when it comes to sustainability, because that's a role that a government needs to play also as a shareholder. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time today. Let me just quickly squeeze in 2 questions, which I think might be important. One is coming from Lennart regarding kind of coming back to the basic issue of to what extent a state can really direct a state-owned company that is also publicly traded. And I know this is a especially big discussion in Finland and also somewhat difficult. I know that Kaarina at least knows this debate very well and can perhaps try to summarize a bit. And then the other is, if you talk with companies like Fortum, what they're basically saying is that even if the EU reduces its emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and goes to climate neutrality by 2050, there is still going to be space for fossil gas. So perhaps if some of you would want to react to that before we close. Kaarina, did you want to go first?
Well, maybe if I only comment on what the state can do, and this applies to all shareholders, by the way, so there's nothing really new about the fact that shareholder rights are certain, also they are enshrined in law. I'm a big fan of Storebrand on this, because you guys are amongst the ones that you would consider gold standard when it comes to engagements. So if you are a shareholder, especially a majority one, often say if there's a shareholder resolution, you're the one who decides, especially since the votes are counted based on those who come to the AGM rather than the overall ownership. So actually the Finnish government in a way has more power than, more than 50%. And this was already seen last AGM, since we did file the resolution to change the articles of association of Fortum. And the idea was, if it's enshrined there, that you have a 1.5 pathway, that would actually allow you to run down assets even if they make a loss. So you wouldn't have to maximize, shareholder value. Unfortunately, the state did not back that. Many other financial institutions did. We didn't get the number of votes that we would have needed, so the state should have been there to support us. But there was only one example that was done in a quite by the book kind of way, introducing the shareholders, different initiatives, and then voting on them. But I mean, the state has a lot of soft power as well that happens, behind the scenes. So if you take the previous governments, Fortum has actually been pushed and tossed around quite a lot, completely stepping over the minority shareholders. And this was seen with the nuclear debate in the past, where Fortum was kind of taken in as an investor to have enough domestic ownership in order to bring a nuclear project forward. The government has done that quite happily in the past. It hasn't maybe been communicated on, but it has happened. So again, the reason why the current Finnish government with Greens as sitting ministers are not taking stronger stances when all the financial institutions are doing that with very smaller shares is a little bit baffling to me. So that's something I cannot answer on why that happens, but there's no institutional boundary to it. So the government could do more.
Thank you. Then regarding space for gas in the future in low carbon scenarios, would this come back to Frida perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I made the points about the climate impact of gas. I think they should speak for themselves. But I also think that the facts, and especially around gas infrastructure, will speak strongly for themselves. So I think in the end, and there again, there is the link, of course, to the big responsibility of the governments themselves, which if they are involved with such organization, with such corporations. We have, for example, in Spain, an LNG terminal, which is mothballed. It costs 23 million per year. And this is just to keep it ready for use at some point, and it has not. That has been many years that it's running like that. So we have actually, and especially if it's a regulated asset, we have the citizens paying severalfold. They are paying through the tariffs. They're seeing this in the gas bill. They are paying for the externalities, and they're paying through still ongoing fossil fuel subsidies. So I think it's time, especially that these facts are also more raised awareness about, and that indeed there is the responsibility of the states to protect their citizens from these manifold costs, and then above all, something that is of course not as tangible, but getting it more and more, the climate crisis and all the costs that the inaction entails.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time. This has been such a rich discussion that it would be impossible for me to summarize everything. At least I've learned a lot. Let me just highlight a couple of points. We know that coal is already unprofitable in an increasing number of cases, but it is still shielded from competition. So it's not, there's no level playing field in many markets between coal and sustainable options. I would pose the question if fossil gas is going to be the new coal, and if fossil gas is going to go down the same road as we have seen with coal over the past years, and how different actors should prepare for that type of a future. Policymakers and investors are reacting, they are making changes, and that is going to have an impact on the market for sure. Just transition needs to be at the core. We need to make sure that no one is left behind when we transition away from fossil fuels. And then finally, companies like Fortum can play a constructive role, and they can facilitate the transition. So even though they were not with us, unfortunately, today in this discussion, we hope that they get the message that they have a role to play, and there are many ways to do that. So it just remains for me to thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, to the presenters. Thank you to the participants. Thank you for the great questions. And of course, the organizers who made all this possible. There will be, like I said earlier, a recording available of this event. So if you want to come back to this, or you want to share it with your colleagues and friends, or you want to give a tip to a journalist who might be interested in these topics, that is definitely possible. And perhaps let's see, we might share some resources that were highlighted in the chat with all the participants afterwards, and hope they can be put to good use. So take care, stay safe, and goodbye.
Thank you, Ars.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.